everybody. Welcome to another edition in the Timebank Foundations program. This is where we're just trying to share a few bits of knowledge or opinions or ideas just on the more sort of fundamental parts of our profession. We're going to be discussing suitability reports in this session. Potentially one of the most exciting parts of the financial planning profession, it's fair to say, certainly for a paraplanner like me. We're just going to be sort of breaking it down and just exploring a few myths that we could potentially break and just looking at a bit of good practice, basically. There's something I need to deal with before we get into that. So my name's Damien Davies. I started the Timebank back in 2002. We basically sell busy advisors and paraplanners time. That's what we do, time, skills and experience. But there is an unfortunate rumour circulating around the industry about me, and that is that I am related to David Walliams, that I'm potentially David Walliams' camper, less attractive younger brother. It's sadly one of those genetic conditions that, you know, it's been cursing me my entire life. It's probably why I grew this ridiculous facial hair, just to try and escape it. Anyway, to try and escape it further, what I'm doing through these sessions is taking kind of familiar faces within the industry and running them through some celebrity doppelganger websites. So as we're talking about suitability reports, I thought I'd pick on this fella, Mr. Rory Percival, ex of the FCA and of course with his own consulting business now. So we took his picture and we ran it through a website, and the first thing it did is it analysed some of the facial characteristics. Fortunately, Rory, you're 97% male, which is good. So you're 3% in touch with your feminine side. And rather harshly, they think you're 45 years old. Obviously, we all know different to that. But in terms of the people that you look like, there's some quite interesting names that kind of cropped up there. So I'm not sure whether the system was having an off day or what. But hey, you've got to take it where you can, can't you? So let's ignore the fact that I look like David Walliams and let's perhaps focus on Rory Percival being the financial services equivalent of Colin Firth. Right, so suitability reports. Suitability reports in themselves, they're not really something you need to worry about in isolation. It is part of the wider sort of suitability process. So there's really two parts of COBS that I'd suggest you read after this, just to sort of help digest some of the kind of content. The first is COBS 9.2. So COBS 9.2 is the part of COBS that focuses on assessing suitability. And it's got quite an interesting definition of what suitability actually is. This is the nuts and bolts of what we do at the end of the day, basically as a profession. And then what we can do is we can overlay that against COBS 9.4. So that's the part of COBS that deals with suitability reports. And there's an interesting definition of what a suitability report is in COBS 9.4. And it's fair to say, if there weren't those three words in bold within that definition, there wouldn't be a compliance industry, there wouldn't be a paraplanning industry, and life would be a lot more simple. But sadly, they exist. And that's the bit that I'm going to try and help you with this session, really, is just trying to take out some of the complications around suitability reports. Some of the things that we see, we've been doing this a long time, so I started the Timebank back in 2002, and there's a few kind of repeated problems that I think occur, and the main one is that firms try and do too much with their suitability reports. You know, obviously they've got suitability obligations they've got to kind of put in there. They try and make it engaging for the client, and they've also got compliance over their shoulder, sort of saying, hey, look, you need to do this and you need to do this. And I think as a result, suitability reports can sometimes get a little bit cumbersome and a little bit overweight. Thank you, enough of that. A little bit overweight in terms of what they're actually trying to achieve. So this is typically what it kind of looks like. If you take a kind of a pyramid in terms of the content, we tend to see most of the content like a weighted around compliance guff, I call it. It's a slightly uncouth phrase, but I think you know what I mean. That's where you're trying to cover your arse. You know, you're trying to protect yourself. Quite often when firms engage us, one of the first questions they ask is, are your reports compliant? And that's a huge question because there's so many definitions of compliance or interpretations of compliance. So yeah, you've got to remember, if something goes wrong with a client and there's a complaint, you know, the suitability report isn't there to defend you. It's there to justify what you've recommended as being suitable rather than protecting you against every scenario that could go wrong. You know, the Ombudsman, if a complaint gets to the Ombudsman isn't a judicial service. So they're not there to kind of decide right or wrong. They're there to assess suitability. So when you put too much weight of emphasis on protecting yourself, it can immediately kind of spark maybe potentially quite uncomfortable considerations that the regulator may be considering about what your actual intentions were. The next weight of emphasis is around standard text, you know, putting too much standard text in there that potentially isn't relevant to the circumstance or to the transaction that's being discussed in the report. So, you know, if you're recommending a SIP, you get these blocks of text that drop into the reports that talk about every aspect of SIPs and how they can buy commercial property and how much borrowing you can have and all this sort of stuff. So that can be a little bit alienating for a client. It can be quite obstructive to try and have to wade through this. And you see it in real life when advisors kind of apologize for the suitability report. I'm sorry, I've got to give you this. But that's because it's just too bulky. The next weight of emphasis tends to be around the actual advice. Now, this is the most important bit when you think about it. This is the bit that the client's really interested in. This is the bit that they've engaged the advisor for. So it should be the real song and dance part of it when you think about it. And of course, the last bit is the actual objectives. You know, we tend to see that there's so little emphasis put on the objectives and the client's sort of current situation. It doesn't really work well for that person. They're not potentially feeling engaged. You know, the weight of emphasis is just wrong. And I genuinely think if you took that pyramid and you inverted it, it would be the perfect suitability report. You know, if the most weight of emphasis was around who that person is, what they're trying to achieve, how you're going to help them achieve it, that's going to be really engaging for the client. And you're not going to be able to escape all of the compliance guff. You know, some of it has to be in there, but if it's the least amount possible, then that's great. So that's what we typically see. But what does the regulator actually say needs to be in a suitability report? So this is where we're looking at COBS 9.4. And actually, if you read COBS 9.4, it's really quite straightforward and it's not very complicated at all. So we mentioned Rory earlier on. Now, he used to do a series of presentations about suitability where he said a suitability report only needs to do 3 things. Well, I agree with him, but actually it needs to do a 4th thing as well, which I'll run through. But basically the 4 aspects that need to be in a suitability report are pretty straightforward. So the first 3 I'm going to identify. So, you know, you've got to talk about the client's demands and needs. And that's a really interesting kind of turn of phrase, demands and needs, because you're putting the client front and center. What is it they demand? What is it they're looking to achieve? And what do they need? What, you know, that's kind of your added value where you're sort of explaining a bit more detail. You've then got to explain why the transaction is appropriate. How is it actually going to help them get there? You know, that's quite often overlooked as well. Too often we focus on a lot of the functionality of what's being recommended rather than what it's actually going to do in terms of a goal. And then the last, or the third part that's really important is to explain any potential disadvantages. Now that potentially seems counterintuitive, but this is where in my experience, majority of complaints come. It's that expectations haven't been managed properly, or there's been some form of a communication breakdown, and the client and the advisor are you know, they're kind of building a tunnel from different ends. Do you know what I mean? And it's not quite gelling, and so, you know, it leads to a complaint. Whereas if you can explain the disadvantages to the client when they actually kind of get into the process, then that expectation's managed from day one. And those 3 things, interestingly, I know I've kind of harked on about it quite a bit, but when you look at COBS 9.2 and you look at COBS 9.4, the interesting thing is that you can potentially write 75% of your suitability report at your fact-finding meeting. So COBS 9.2 outlines these things that you need to find out about your client in order to assess suitability. Now, what we recommend for our clients is if they record their meetings, okay, they then send us the transcription of those meetings, and we transcribe that into a note, a good file note for them to have on record. What that will do is it'll outline all of those parts there. But when you look at what needs to be done in terms of COBS 9.4 suitability reports, the strangely, I know, but the correlation is really, really clear. And I know that's the intention of the regulator, and sometimes the weight of words within the regulation can lose that message. But when you look at how those things correlate, it's really, really clean and it's really, really elegant. So potentially you can come away from a fact-finding meeting with a client with 75% of the suitability report actually written and completed, which is brilliant. The kind of closing part of that circle is, of course, now the MiFID II suitability reports, the interim suitability reports that need to be done every year. They're just fantastic for you in terms of maintaining loyalty from your clients, because you're able to put context to the advice. It's not a transaction, it genuinely is a service, and you're able to outline how suitability works on an ongoing basis. But anyway, going back to the ingredients that need to be in a suitability report. So there's those three things. The fourth one is where the compliance has either a nightmare or a wet dream, which is the fact that you've got to give the client sufficient information as is appropriate according to the complexity of the transaction. Really snappy phrase, that really kind of, really grabs you, doesn't it? But basically what that means is you've got to personalize the suitability report. If it's a dead simple recommendation, it can be a dead simple report. If it's a complicated recommendation, it potentially needs complicated suitability justifications, okay? But what I'm going to give you is an acronym that you can kind of take away and use in your business, just to cover off that little bit there. And that's where the detail of the individual advice comes in, where you're taking that comment about the depth of complexity that needs to go into a report, and you're breaking it down. So the first area that we recommend is cost and risk. So cost is pretty obvious. The best way to produce a cost analysis for clients is with a reduction in yield. Of course, you've got to do ex post and ex ante charging as well now. But the benefit of those is, again, it helps clients understand where they are. Where you're looking at a transfer recommendation, you've got to do a comparison of costs and what you absolutely have to do. There's no right or wrong way to do that. Again, I think reduction in yield works best because it's the cleanest way and it's the easy way for the client to see, because it's just a single number. But whatever mechanism you use, you've got to use the same process on both sides of the transaction. So the existing arrangements, the recommended arrangements, the same calculation routine's got to be applied. Of course, then you're looking at risk, and risk comes at all sorts of different levels, but the most important thing to remember about risk is capacity for loss. It's quite often something that doesn't really get the sort of specific detail that it needs, and of course we had the Woodford situation kind of kicking off. That's the perfect scenario where a capacity for loss requirement needs to be recorded. What risk can this client genuinely take? And that's one of those COBS 9.2 requirements. But if you can elicit that specifically, you're managing expectations again. Next areas to cover are the existing assets and the assets remaining. So the existing assets is anything that you're potentially recommending as a transfer or as a conversion of assets, maybe cash assets to investment assets or something like that. So you've got to cover that off. But what you've also got to cover off is any assets remaining. So if anything isn't considered, you might need to be restructuring it in some way. So maybe you're consolidating 5 pensions and there's a 6th plan which you're not consolidating because it's got really nice tax-free cash. You might want to do something with that in terms of rebasing the investment proposition or something along those lines, just to make it relevant to where you put the client sort of post recommendations. The next 2 areas are the tax and the ultimate goal. Tax explains itself. But again, it's good practice to make sure that you're explaining tax. It's a great way to get in with other professional advisors that the client has as well, the accountants and the solicitors. And the ultimate goal, you've got to frame the advice. You're explaining how it's going to work towards the ultimate goal, because quite often advice doesn't stand on its own as an individual piece of recommendation. It's a process, and it's also a number of areas. So if you're looking at pension planning or investment planning, it's probably going to take into account an element of protection and an element of inheritance tax planning and different family members. So giving context as to how the advice is actually going to work towards the ultimate goal is really, really important. And then lastly, the review frequency and managing expectations tend to go hand in hand. So obviously MiFID II, you're conducting annual suitability for annual fees. So the review is potentially going to be annual. But alongside that, you're managing expectations. So if the review is being done annually, but maybe you're recommending the client take a plan that's an IHT plan that needs to be maintained for 2 years without any action being taken. You need to manage their expectations about that. You need to express that really, really clearly so they know exactly where they stand, and those kind of fit together. So yeah, so that's the way to deal with that woolly, sufficient information is appropriate to the complexity of the transaction. You can take this acronym away with you. It's free, it's my gift. Creature comforts. I'm sure a lot of you guessed that already as we were going through it. Yeah, so that's what it kind of looks like. There's a few things that we recommend you avoid. Reasons why not. In the old days, suitability letters used to be called reasons why letters. I've been doing this long enough to be able to remember things like that. That's where all this, sadly, this grey hair has come from. Reasons why not is, why justification for why you're not recommending something. The doctor doesn't say why they aren't amputating a limb when they're giving you a prescription for antibiotics. They explain why they give you the antibiotics. So if you make it relevant to what's being recommended, you can't go too far wrong. No discernible benefit is a really important thing to avoid. There's two areas that I recommend that you think about with this. The first is with fees. If you're recommending something that's more expensive than the client has currently, there needs to be a discernible benefit for that. There needs to be a commensurate benefit. So it doesn't have to be cheaper, but if it's more expensive, you need to explain that additional value, and the additional cost pays for what it is that is going to help the client achieve their objectives better than what they've got now, okay? And then the second part of that is creating a scenario that you've got no control over. So telling a client that they should transfer to this new investment strategy because they'll get better investment performance. You've got no control over that. You can't guarantee that, so it's best to avoid actually sort of stating that. But yeah, those two things kind of go hand in hand. The next one is generic text. I touched on that at the beginning. The Ombudsman and the regulators, they get a bit twitchy when they see lots of standard text in a report because it means that you haven't personalised it. You've just knocked this together to, because you've got to, sort of thing. So if you're trying to avoid generic text, I mean, maybe you want to have a library of generic text that you make available to clients if they want to read, what an ISA is, newsletters, things like that. They may be quite useful because you're not having to bulk out the suitability reports then. Jargon and waffle. Jargon probably more so in our profession. When you think about how many acronyms there are, we're dreadful for it. And that can be quite alienating as well for a client. When you're talking to them about the alpha of the investment, with the R squared, I don't know what it means, and a client's going to feel pretty intimidated by it. So, yeah, just try and avoid jargon. And then the last one is this thing called Franklin's Gambit. This is the notion where you go into a scenario with a predetermined outcome. So the idea might be you're a scientist, that you've got a theory about something, and you conduct a series of experiments to prove what you're kind of thinking, or you adapt it to make it suit your way of thinking. That's something that's really quite, I think it's something that once the current kerfuffle's kind of dealt with the regulators, that they'll be looking at quite closely, because centralised investment propositions and all the rest of it, if they're not used well or carefully, they can lead to this outcome. The regulator refers to it as retrofitting these days. The idea that where a client's going to end up before you've even asked them about their objectives. So have a look at our separate presentation on centralised investment propositions if you like, but the message there to take away is that a centralised investment proposition is a process, okay? It's not a thing, it's not an outcome, it's not an investment fund or a platform. It's a process that a client goes through to understand what they might be looking at in terms of an outcome, okay? So yeah, Franklin's Gambit, the regulator doesn't like it. But it's not all doom and gloom. There are some really, really good things. And these are a few sort of takeaways that I'd like to sort of share with you that will create beautiful suitability reports, because that's what it's all about at the end of the day. Real objectives. We recommend our clients record the meetings, as I said. They then send the recordings to us and we transcribe those. What that means is that we can take the wording as to what the client actually states as their objectives in their own words. You think about people, they're all different. Your clients will be a senior engineer in a paint factory one day and the head of drama in a secondary school the next day. Now they're going to have really different ways in which they frame their relationship with money, detail, complexity. And they're probably going to word objectives in a different way. The engineer is probably going to be quite factual, and the drama teacher is going to be quite sort of esoteric. So If you word the objectives of the client says in their own words, it's going to be a lot more engaging for the clients. And at the same time, if you can create real solutions to the objectives that they create, it's going to be really engaging for that client. So there's an article on our website, a blog article called The Man in the Mirror, which you're more than welcome to read, which talks about an issue that a large vertically integrated business had, where they had a complaint made against them about a transfer that they'd recommended, where it just didn't achieve anything that they were looking to achieve. And the reason is that they focused all of their suitability on the functionality. You know, they had a fabulous team of researchers and access to 8 million online funds and all this sort of stuff, and they hadn't mentioned the objectives once. So real solutions to objectives that are placed in the client's own words is where you'll get it right. Absolutely much more engaging for the client. And then an elegant summary telling the client what they want to do or what they need to do in order to achieve their objectives is going to be really good as well. You quite often get that client that says, listen, Damien, I trust you, just tell me what to do. That's great, because they've got a summary there, and then they can know exactly what you're recommending. Give them the highlights in terms of those main points that need to be in the suitability report, and you'll cover off 95% of the rationale behind suitability. Next one to look at is graphics and interaction. So we did an exercise about 7 or 8 years ago where we redesigned what suitability reports should be. It was a brilliant exercise. We just geeked out, basically. We looked at the rules and we looked at what the perceived norms were and just thought, right, okay, well, what would it look like? So we designed essentially an interactive PDF. It was dead simple to engage with, but quite complicated behind it, because what you could do is you could actually follow an objective through all the way, different levels, getting as much detail as the client would want. So if it was the person who just wants to know what to do, you could click on the objective of retiring at age 50, see how the cash flow flowed through, link it through to the recommendations for the individual pensions and ISAs, how that was going to work, nice little summary, job done. But then for the engineer who wanted a lot more detail, it ran off in a different tangent, ran through charges, ran through all the bits and pieces about how it was offset. So it's great, it covered all scenarios, but it was elegant and it was simple and it was interactive and had lots of graphics. A word, I don't know what the cliche is, but it takes a lot less effort for a person to understand a concept with an image than it does with lots of words. So words are great and they're important, but if you want engagement, graphics are fantastic. And then lastly, reviewing suitability, and this is the bit all about client loyalty. This is the bit where, when you think about the relationship with the client, this is probably the most important bit. It's keeping that client forever. And if you review suitability, you can't go too far wrong because they look forward to that process then. So that's really the message. I think the key point to take away is to, don't get too hung up on anything. When you're talking about compliance, it's the file that needs to be compliant. It's like the academic work that goes into the report, or the actual advice is on file, and then the report itself is just the highlight. It's like the executive summary of all of that work. You don't need to have all of the workings out. You don't need to have all of the bits in the report. That can be in the file, and then the report is just an engaging document for you and the client to use. And that's pretty much it. That's the kind of basics of suitability reports. By all means, call us up, talk to us about what it might look like for you. The regulator is always evolving, so it's something that, as things go forward, there's new innovations all of the time. So have a little look at the other resources we've got available through the Foundations program. And of course, by all means, please subscribe to any of the other sessions as well. There's quite an ecosystem within financial planning, and it's quite useful to sometimes sort of take a little step back and look at all of the other options. If you enjoyed this, please tell your friends. This is a free service that we're making available to people, just sharing, like I said at the beginning, a little bit of knowledge, a little bit of thought and a little bit of insight. So it's great to kind of get as many people involved as possible. Thank you very much.